Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Humanizing Healthcare, Integrating Trusted Measurement with Impactful Solutions, sponsored by Feedtrail and the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. Today's session agenda, as we have this discussion, we'll be talking about collecting better data, solutions that work, and then using those solutions to truly move the needle and improve your culture. A couple things before we get started on some housekeeping. We are using the webinar mode of Zoom today, and so as attendees, you will be able to use the Q&A feature during the session to offer questions or comments to the panelists that will be answered as time allows during the Q&A section at the end. There's no anonymity when you ask those questions. Additionally, there's no chat or raising of hand functions. So if you should need to communicate with us, please use the Q&A. So with that, today I am your moderator. My name is Jennifer Clark. I am a hospice and palliative medicine physician and a faculty at the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. My colleagues joining on the panel include Paul Jaglowski, who is the CEO of Feedtrail, Dr. Bill Maples, who is the president and CEO of the Institute for Healthcare Excellence, Dr. West Paul, the CCO of New Hanover Regional Medical Center. So I am glad you all are able to join us in your busy schedules today. Thank you for being here. So to kick off kind of the session today, I'd like to kind of set the context for our conversation. As many of you on the webinar know, clinician burnout is at an all-time high. Even though we're amidst a true pandemic, burnout is its own pandemic and has really affected healthcare, particularly across the last couple of decades. And as we know, clinician engagement is a key component to that. And unfortunately, it hasn't been included as a holistic approach, particularly around the collection of data and clinician engagement in the collection of that information to really approach better patient outcomes and true not only patient experience, but patient and clinician experience. And then as we've seen, the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't created this situation. It's really brought this situation to a much greater, more grave light. And so with that, IHE and Feedtrail felt it was time to have a significant conversation about what we can do to be proactive, to move us from the conversation around burnout to one around resiliency and ultimately thriving. So with that, I'd like to launch into our discussion today, first by really talking about collecting better data. And so we'll start with Paul as kind of the data guru amongst the panelists. We know that accurate data, particularly stuff that is trustworthy and really translatable into solutions, as well as data that can actually justify, really the necessary investment. Can you share with us what you've been doing at Feedtrail to really address this, kind of gap in need?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Clark, and thank you all for joining us today. As she mentioned, my name is Paul Jaglowski. I am the CEO of Feedtrail, and our team at Feedtrail believes wholeheartedly that in order for healthcare organizations to thrive, both from a patient and clinician satisfaction standpoint, it's paramount that they prioritize building a culture driven by both patient and clinician engagement, because one simply will not thrive without the other. We've had the pleasure of working with over 50 health systems and over 3,000 individual hospitals or clinics that have committed to building a culture driven by these real-time insights. And the impacts on their patient and clinician loyalty have really been astounding. So I'm going to touch on a few best practices we've seen, as well as some learnings we've experienced. And I know this webinar is focused primarily on the clinician engagement piece, but it really is worth touching on the patient satisfaction side because they don't exist in separate compartments. They are absolutely linked together. And of course, it makes sense that happier clinicians are more engaged on the job. And as a result, will take better care of their patients and have better outcomes. And studies continue to demonstrate this link as well. According to a 2015 National Employee Engagement Survey, for every 1% increase in employee engagement, an organization's overall HCAHPS rating increases by 1/3%, and patients' willingness to recommend the hospital increases by 0.25%. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to quickly touch on the first piece of the puzzle for ensuring your clinician base is engaged and ultimately capable of delivering positive patient outcomes, especially, as Jen mentioned, in today's day and age with the unique challenges the COVID pandemic is presenting. And the first piece is the importance of having good data. This idea of utilizing good data to inform solutions is really a vital component of any strategy for improving clinician engagement. So, what is the difference between data and good data? Well, let's start with the status quo. We know that you all at healthcare organizations have tons of data already. The challenge is very little data that you have actually leads to results, and that simply shouldn't be the case. The reason why data gets a bad rep is because much of the data that you're used to collecting is either high level, it's after the fact, and as a result, it's unactionable. We're all too familiar with HCAHPS and CGCAHPS, and I'm willing to bet that most, if not all of you, have exhausted the insights you can glean from your CAHPS data. And to be clear, let me take a step back. HCAHPS surveying is absolutely a step in the right direction to ensure positive experiences across the country. But the standardized questions with the one-size-fits-all mentality simply don't provide teams with the insights they can use to inform that lasting improvement. And this is just on the patient side. Clinician engagement data has long been limited to annual surveys or annual performance reviews, which leaves organizations with maybe a few general themes to focus on with the hopes of making lasting impacts on their culture. And that's just not realistic. And even worse, these organizations often aren't able to do anything with the data they collect because it's not prescriptive, which rightfully causes clinicians to lose faith and trust in that experience data. And unfortunately, this has taken a toll on clinicians across the country. Burnout, as Jen mentioned, has become rampant, even more so now, with many clinicians leaving their jobs or the industry altogether at shocking rates. And again, I don't want to quote reports all day long, but a 2019 report from the National Academy of Medicine estimated that the annual cost of turnover and reduced productivity due to burnout among physicians in the U.S. was greater than $4 billion. And the impact of this burnout obviously extends far beyond the financial loss. So without understanding why clinicians are burnt out and then identifying opportunities for improvement among your specific teams, it becomes nearly impossible to experience any lasting success and drive these improvement initiatives. And these annual or overarching surveys are a prime example of how the historical or generic measurement might identify a problem, but it doesn't tell anyone what to do to fix that problem. And we see and hear this time and time again with our partners. We hear things like, our clinicians don't trust our data, or we've been collecting data for years and nothing has improved. And the reality is, all of these are symptoms of relying on what we call bad data, because data is useful only if it is relevant, personalized, and actionable enough to inform lasting solutions. So that leads to the question, how do you get good data? Well, there's two ways. So first of all, you must treat people as individuals who have unique experiences and engage with them accordingly. We cannot rely on these standardized surveys to learn from clinicians and or patients. We understand that benchmarks are helpful because it helps you understand how you're performing relevant to your peers or your neighbors. But the only way you can actually tailor your solutions based on your particular organization's needs is by asking questions that are relevant to your stakeholders at that specific point in time. You really have to listen to what matters most to your team, not just the industry as a whole. And you must engage with these individuals in real time and at the appropriate points in their experience with your organization. One of the biggest issues with CAHPS on the patient experience side and these annual surveys on the clinician side is that oftentimes it takes weeks or months to collect and analyze these responses you're getting. So even if you do uncover a problem, you can't actually solve it because the problem is either no longer exists, right? It was temporary, or it has evolved into something more serious. And I want to be clear, a lot of people think of real time as within 48 or 72 hours of an experience. But to our team at Feedtrail, real time means truly in the moment that same day. So by asking these relevant questions in the moment, you can actually pursue meaningful service recovery and address issues before they become larger problems that have a lasting impact or threat to your culture. And you can also ensure that the appropriate solutions or trainings or resources you're putting in place are being made available to your team. All right, so now this concept of real-time relevant engagement is something that many of our clients have absolutely bought into, and as a result are experiencing tremendous improvements. And while we at Feedtrail knew it was important, the criticality of this intentional clinician engagement was very clearly confirmed in a recent nationwide survey that we completed this spring. So next slide, if you don't mind. Between the months of April and May of this year, obviously as soon as the COVID-19 pandemic really took off, we performed a nationwide survey in partnership with a nurse networking organization called Hollywood, where we had over 10,000 nurses and physicians across the United States participate in an effort to better understand what clinicians were experiencing as it relates to the unique demands of the pandemic. Now, of course, we heard plenty about their experiences with PPE shortages and the challenges of staying focused and engaged at work with all of the uncertainties of the pandemic. But what quickly became apparent, to no surprise, was that the lack of engagement from leadership was exacerbating the burnout being felt by many of our frontline staff. You know, a few statistics worth mentioning is of the thousands of clinicians surveyed, 46% said they were seriously considering leaving their organization or the industry altogether as a result of their experience during the pandemic. But what's interesting is it wasn't due to a lack of PPE or the safety concerns. That's not what was causing the burnout. It was still that inconsistent engagement. So specifically, it was a lack of appreciation from management, a need for better and more consistent communication, and a desire for more nurse-driven and physician-driven policies and procedures. So even in times of crisis, the same exact concepts of wanting to be heard and acknowledged continue to be of utmost importance. You know, this survey really reiterated the importance of this intentional clinician engagement for building a culture and workforce that feels empowered to deliver good patient care, even in these extreme circumstances of this COVID-19 pandemic. And it's something to really keep in mind as we move beyond this, or as we move into the next wave of this pandemic, that in order to deliver that high quality patient care, it is critical that you are engaging with your care team to ensure that their concerns are being heard and also being addressed. So before I hand it over to Dr. Maples to discuss the second key piece of this puzzle, I want to reiterate two key points. One is, in order to identify these opportunities for improvement and implement these lasting solutions, you first have to understand your unique situation. And the way to do that is by ensuring that you are consistently collecting and engaging with and learning from your stakeholders. So to be clear, this does not just mean you need to collect more data, right? That sounds intimidating, that sounds daunting, that sounds overwhelming, but it does mean that you need to collect more relevant data. And there are some tried and true methods of doing that we're happy to share with you. And two, it's the importance of pairing this clinician and patient engagement together. That cannot be overstated. Once you ensure your clinician engagement strategy is sound and your teams feel supported, you will quickly see an impact on your patient satisfaction and your patient outcomes. All right, so that's all for me. I will hand it over to Dr. Maple and then Dr. Westphal.
So Paul, actually, I'm curious, kind of, you know, I hear kind of all the things that you have said. Primary ones are, you know, really intentional, individual and timely, you know, kind of assessment and really communication, whether it be at the patient level and or provider or combined level. And I'm curious what West and Bill have experienced both as clinicians and as administrators, kind of working in that concept of use of data.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul, for a really rich discussion of the data collection and accurate, timely, and all. Question, and connecting the patient and the clinician engagement data together. What approach have you found helpful to really help organizations connect the patient and clinician engagement data together? Because oftentimes these sit in separate buckets. Sometimes they sit in separate departments within healthcare organizations, and they never really connect and talk to each other.
That's a question for me, Dr. Maples?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very good question, and it's something that's pretty interesting. So, the timeliness of all this data is really important. I don't just mean by collecting it during the experience, but by engaging with your clinicians and your patients about the same interactions they are having. It really is empowering and it really is informative because it helps you identify from two totally unique perspectives, but both very intimate perspectives, what their experience was like interaction and with the way in which they communicated throughout that experience. So, of course, we can go into the details of how the software solution supports this, but the reality is, focusing on specific interaction and understanding how they played off each other and what the unique perspectives were on both sides of that interaction really does provide some insightful detail into how one side interpreted it compared to the other.
I'll just chime in a little bit. For those of you on the call, I'm presently working in a hospital system that is dealing with COVID on a regular basis, and certainly, never let a good crisis go without use. We are seeing those strains on the system with provider engagement, but strangely enough, the more engaged the provider is, the more, and I hate the word provider, I'll say clinician, I'll say physician, but the more they understand the value of the satisfaction, the patient experience data. And strangely enough, it always gets better. The more they're engaged, the more they want to make it better. So it's kind of an interesting aspect. But I know some of you on the phone may have been involved. Now that we're in COVID, we can't personally round as much as we used to. We can't have that interaction. It's very hard to understand the frontline staffs, whether they be physicians or nurse, really what they're dealing with unless you're there with them. So some of it is you don't want to round, you don't want to bring COVID, you don't want to catch COVID. That being said, but you still have to have that communication venue. So it's more critical today in our COVID crisis, which I know you guys know is not going away. In fact, maybe getting worse a bit. But to have this type of data to understand what is going on at the frontline provider level, and then tying that to the patient experience, because most of the questions I'm getting from my providers, particularly my ICU doctors, have to do with how do we make sure our patients are communicated well with. We're distance from PPE, we're distance from, you can't have visitors, so this is incredibly critical right now.
Yeah, thank you guys for your comments. I mean, I think everyone, probably attendees, panelists at all, are kind of in the heart of this. And so, Bill, I'm curious, as we transition from data, kind of what can we do about it? Kind of what are we seeing as really the solutions aspects of things? What solutions have worked? And I know that at IHE, you have a kind of cohort of clinicians, multidisciplinary, that have developed significant and efficacious solutions. So can you kind of walk us through what IHE has done to take this data and really develop it into solutions that work?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I can I have the next slide? Before I actually launch into some of the approaches that we're using, I just want to highlight some themes and tie them back to what Paul has already introduced, and then connect it to the solution pathway. It's a challenge for healthcare organizations and teams to really come up with meaningful solutions. If we would have been successful, we would have had dramatic improvements in patient experience and engagement scores over the years, and it's just been hard to come by. So tying that really excellent data that Paul outlined for us with solutions is critical, and we often run into some pitfalls. One of the challenges we run into is we get our data back, and many times we'll focus on tactical solutions. So the picture in the focusing on the right thing is we find that parking is a problem, and so it's easy to fix, and there's nothing wrong with fixing it. But when you really look at the table to the right of the parking of what patients really want, they really want to be listened to, heard, and understood. And it's amazing if you think, when you look back at the data that Paul just showed us, it's the same thing that staff really wants. They want to be appreciated. They want to be recognized. They want to be heard. They want to be validated. They want input into processes and policies. And we oftentimes fix, when you say go create an action plan, we do a lot of work around tactical things that have value but are missing the boat. And one of the reasons why we end up not having the results we want. A second pitfall is this issue of frequency of data or quality of data. And a lot depends upon how we're even asking the questions. So I just want to focus on HCAHPS for a minute. And when you ask about, did your provider or did your nurse listen? We can have lots of puzzle pieces where people say yes, they listen, but it's a different question when you ask, did your physician or nurse listen to understand? Because that really gets the connection and the trust built that you need to really execute the difficult work that's on every clinician's plate every day. And fitting those puzzle pieces together is more critical than just a response. I always do this, sometimes do it. No, how are you doing it? And how can we make certain our data gets to that point? And then the third piece is the timely data. We oftentimes are creating action plans 6 months later on data that was collected 6 months earlier. And the relevance piece really comes highlighted. So as you think of your solutions, make certain you don't fall into these pitfalls. Next slide, please. The work that Paul was outlining in terms of better communication, more appreciation, more recognition, input into policies and procedures is being heard, is all really centered around changing the culture, enriching the culture. And that's the work that we sometimes either don't know how to do or we shy away from doing because it can be difficult. This is a nice slide from Dr. Michael Leonard that looked at the teamwork culture within different departments in a hospital. Same policies, same procedures, et cetera, but it's the way the team connected and worked together. And when the teamwork scores were high on the right, everything improved. Not only HCAHPS and experience cultures, but your actual clinical outcomes, your C. diff infections, your pressure ulcers, all of the things that we strive to do and deliver actually improve. So investing in skills that will actually drive the culture will actually drive your engagement and your improvement. It's thinking back at Paul's data that he shared with us again, you can't just go to a team and say communicate better or recognize me a little bit more or appreciate me a little bit more, and I'll try to do that. Those are skills that you have to learn, practice, and integrate into the daily work. So on the next slide, the approach that the Institute for Healthcare Excellence has taken is really five steps. And we first absolutely need the measurement that Paul is talking about. And we have to measure thriving, the recovery, the resilience, and we have to understand really what is happening within the organization. What are things that are enriching the culture? What are things that are getting in the way before we go into the work? We then take that and work with leadership, because it's critical that leadership creates an environment that will actually promote a culture of trust, a culture that really embeds recognition and appreciation within it. And those are a specific set of skills that are necessary to really create that. A culture that can give appropriate feedback timely to their team members so that each team member can reach peak performance. In addition, the team itself needs to have the skills to be able to also create the environment that we're all striving for to really reach that peak performance. How do they connect with patients? How do they connect with each other? How do they listen to understand? How do they actually weave appreciation into their work? And how do they receive the information from leadership that will actually be the most productive? And then the next piece that we work on hits at this, I want to have some input into the processes, the policies, so I'm part of the team. And that's a redesign of how we do that work and engage the clinical team in critical processes so that their voice is heard and the workflow actually connects to things for them that put joy back into their work. And then lastly, putting it together, we spend some time weaving all of the skills from leadership to the team to the processes and design what is it going to look like going forward. And it's not a revolutionary change, but it's small changes in frequent doses that actually allow the team to really perform and reach peak performance. With that, engage, and the experience culture is enriched around. So that is the approach that we take to really drive that culture, so that we can take the data that we get from Paul and then drive it forward and into meaningful solutions and customized solutions for each department, for each institution, each organization.
Bill, it's interesting seeing the evolution of the experience kind of field, if you will, evolve from this tactile based approach, using outdated, poor quality data. Obviously, it was something we had to start somewhere. And now, kind of organizations like Feedtrail and IHE are really moving this conversation towards really the development of new sets of skills and a focus really on, kind of all of these elements, communication, teamwork, a process mapping with the viewpoint of what are the highest touch points and the experiences that really do need to happen versus the quintessential never events, And so I'm curious, West and Paul, kind of, what have you also seen in this transition in your work, as we go from this tactile to more very much communication, humanistic approach to really creating an enriched experience culture?
Okay, sure. So one thing that we've had the unique opportunity to participate in with a number of our partners is we've actually held focus groups with patient and family advisory councils, with clinician groups at these organizations. And you talk about this human-centered, this communication, this whole kind of transformation through what engagement looks like. And we mapped out, literally, we built process maps and mapped out their normal experience in various journeys through healthcare, whether it be as a patient, whether it be as a provider, et cetera. And it was really enlightening, because it was interesting to see at what points in their experience either they have heightened anxiety, or they have an interest or willingness to share what's on their mind, or at what point does it not make sense to engage with them because they might have something else pressing that they're looking forward to or thinking about. And this just touches on that piece of treating each individual as an individual and engaging at the appropriate point in time. And as a result, you gain far more useful insights into what's actually going on. And you get the buy-in from that stakeholder to actually participate and share. Because again, we've all had the experience where, let's say we had a rental car experience. We get an email 2 weeks after the fact. How was your enterprise experience? Nothing against enterprise, but I don't remember the details of that. Or same thing if you're in a hotel. Once you've already checked out, they're asking about the minutiae of your stay. Especially in healthcare where there's such dynamic experiences, both for the patient and the clinician, it's really critical if you want to learn that you engage in a meaningful and intentional way. And that, again, that informs these customized solutions that Dr. Maples was mentioning, right? It's not a it's not a one size fits all. It really is tailored to each organization to ensure it has that, not just an immediate, but that lasting impact and adoption.
So I would tag on to that, and I would also go back to what Dr. Maples said. We can't lose sight of the fact that this is a cultural transformation. It is just not a formulaic solution. And in my experience, and I've done this with several organizations now, and in the process with my new organization, of trying to find what is the hook, what is the triggers to get my clinical people involved in this work with a different understanding, because they all know this anyway. This is kind of the heart of why they are healthcare providers. And I like the word that Bill uses all the time, that joy in work. They know that. They want that. And how you make that connection back to that joy is that accelerant to get this work going. So, I mean, it can't be lost track that this is truly a cultural change. It doesn't happen quick, but you got to start, and this is where you start.
And so I guess that segues great into our last piece of things, kind of really around this application. And so, as we're talking about multiple viewpoints, we've talked about patients and we've talked about clinicians. West, I really want to talk to you about the administrative viewpoint and around the establishment and the sustainability, particularly around the investment of an enriching experience culture. And so can you speak to that piece of things, what the business case is and what the part that administration can really bring to the conversation?
Absolutely. And I am both administrator and physician. Hopefully I'm seen by each as the same. It is a hard conversation at first, depending on where your executive team is in the understanding of what culture does for your organization. There are some teams that know it, that understand it. They just need solutions and point them in the right direction. There are some that have to be convinced. So there's various ways to do that. If it's the old bottom line, formulaic healthcare administration, I got to make no money, no mission, it's fairly easy. It's really, if you look at what is on the table with regard to this work, just from a financial standpoint, with value-based purchasing, I mean, we're looking at millions and millions of dollars with readmissions, with all of that work that improves dramatically with this work. The case is relatively easy. Go further, go into the risk, go into what are your biggest safety events. One of my organizations really were triggered to do this work because they realized their most egregious misses as a medical staff were built around communication with both each other as well as the patient. So they immediately got it. It was almost like a light bulb coming in and saying, oh my God, here's our problem. Let's do this work. So there's ways to get each of them triggered. The money thing is there. It's not. I don't think that is missed on anyone these days, particularly with the programs we have, whether it be CMS or elsewhere. The cost of not doing this from a risk management standpoint is absolutely huge, and most legal people in your organizations will tell you that and tell you that quickly. But back to the joy of work, and I keep going back to that because that seems to be a lot of my conversation today. My people like doing this work. The physicians and nurses, they like doing this work. As a business case, I will guarantee you most administrators, directors like their people happy doing the work because they get so much more out of them. I mean, I'll just tell you, my productivity, they're solving things I've never told them to solve, to have solutions for. And it's purely amazing once this gets going. So that's some of it. I mean, that's a good point question, but I hate to say this, and I don't say this curtly, involving and convincing administration or executive staff is usually the easier part. Convincing your frontline staff, your physicians, I know physician engagement comes up, is a little bit harder, but you have to connect them with where they live, not as an outside entity or an outside group going, you should do this because you don't do it well. It has to come from internal, but it's there, and there's ways to do it. Data is really the first thing they need. Almost all physicians and nurses are driven by data. Real time, this is mentioned at the beginning, actionable data that you can show to someone and say, yeah, they say, yeah, that's me. That's what I do. That's my problem. Then they believe it and they move forward. As Paul said, if they don't see that, you're immediately discredited. So you've got to start with good, actionable data. And then you've got to have programs that are really have been worked out, such as IHE, to be able to march through this in a way that makes people understand where they're going. I think that's part of the key part. And I will tell you, every medical staff is different, but every medical staff kind of has the same at their core. So I think that's a lot of it.
I'm curious, kind of, Bill and Paul, kind of, your day-to-day interactions are with West's colleagues in administration. Kind of, what are your conversations that you've been having from this viewpoint of, really helping people who are making the decisions see the value of, kind of timely, very individualized, relevant, multi-viewpoint data combined with, kind of the solutions and the investment in that. I'm curious, kind of maybe start with you, Bill, and then go to Paul.
Yeah. So, thanks, and Jen, for teeing that up. Because as I was listening to Wes, it seemed pretty easy. The money's there, the ROI is there, the risk is there, the safety is there, and everybody gets it and wants to do it. And that's all true, but that's kind of what I feel after we've begun the work, and it becomes really easy. But I'd be interested in Wes's thoughts of if all of that's true. It seems to me, my experience from from Jen's question is that it's a really, really hard journey to get people to the point of actually beginning the work. Once they begin, it feeds itself and they see it and they recognize it and they won't want to stop it. But I'm just curious.
I think Bill's right. I probably made it sound way too easy. I'll tell you, my previous organization that has done incredibly well with this, it took 2 to 3 years to really get them where they need to be. This is not a short-term, as I say, cultural change doesn't happen overnight. And it's more like, wearing down, the stone with water than it is anything else. It is a hard, and some of this is simply by recruiting. There's people in the organizations that already understand this and know it, and gradually recruiting these and getting that, overcoming the inertia and creating that momentum is really the key. But it's not horribly difficult. It can be done, but you have to be attuned to this every single day in your leadership to make sure you connect those dots. Maybe I should say there's almost everything we do on a daily basis, whether a physician, administration or not, is connected to this work. And if you can just start showing people where it's connected, suddenly it becomes their idea, which is really, really good. Then I don't have to do much more of the work. So no, Bill's absolutely right. It is heavy, but it is there. You can do it. You just have to maintain that. You're absolutely right.
Paul, just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely. So Wes made a good point that often the majority of administration is absolutely bought into this. They understand the importance of all of this. The challenge oftentimes is getting the clinician buy-in, because that's just one of their tasks for them to be concerned with. Their job is to provide quality care. That's what they get out of. And obviously they all want to have positive patient experiences and patient outcomes. But one thing we have seen, especially lately, is if you can tie these patient insights or the feedback or the engagement to and attribute it to individual physicians or providers, that oftentimes ends up being extremely empowering. Because one of the reasons there's been that distrust is the fact that, with, again, I don't mean to continue to go back to HCAHPS, but with the CAHPS data, you might only get the patient's feedback on the final physician they see throughout their entire hospitalization, right? The discharging physician. There's been a lot of distrust that, hey, that data was about so-and-so, it wasn't about me, or that feedback wasn't about me. But now by tying it to individual physicians, and especially now with a lot of the transition and unique aspects of telehealth coming into play, not just administration, but these physicians are also interested in delivering high quality care. And they also know that the interactions they're having on video with patients is far potentially less intimate, or it's objectively different than it was when they were coming in person. So we've seen a lot of physicians become far more curious and interested in what their patients have to say, especially as they're trying to navigate the balance between telehealth and coming back in person.
And so, that kind of wraps the larger part of the conversation we have, obviously starting with Paul and talking about, kind of data, and then moving to Bill and talking about solutions, and then Wes really, kind of reinforcing the idea that we have moved from this tactile mode of experience to one of much more enriching of a culture. And so with that, I'd like to transition into a question and answer session. To remind our attendees, many of you have already submitted some questions that we'll pose to our panelists here. But if you have questions now that are relevant following our initial discussion, please use the Q&A, and we'll try and get to those questions as time allows. So I really appreciate all three of you being willing to take the time out to have this really needed conversation. And so kind of based on our last little bit of conversation, I want to ask Wes the very first question then, kind of how is it that we have the conversation about, kind of helping bridge the gap between administration and clinicians? Kind of what are those, how do we get people on the same page, kind of even prior to the pandemic and now, despite of or within the pandemic itself? I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are on that.
So it's interesting. I had this conversation this morning with my chief operating officer, because we're in the throes of that in our organization. And I mean, it really is that the us, them needs to become we, right? I think we all see that, whether it be a physician, a nurse, or provider or administration. How we cross that chasm is a little bit longer, it's a little bit difficult. I don't particularly like the term physician engagement. I think that almost has some connotations of decisions made before the fact and you're asked permission to do it. And that's what I hear from my physician colleagues is, Dr. Paul, engagement is not making the decision and telling me to do it or asking me if it's okay. It's involving me in the decision. That does take some structural change to make sure physicians are at the table and to actually listen to what they say, because we listen sometimes and won't do anything about it. That's the worst thing you can do, is you can certainly have all the data and listen and just ignore it. So some of it is an engagement maybe at an even lower level. And I found in the past, if you want to start with physician engagement, you don't start with the executive team. You start lower than that. You start at the manager level. You build whatever dyad structures or triad structures you want. But if it starts at the executive team, I think you've already missed the boat. And excuse my terms, but my physicians would agree with me, the ones that I work with, is you can't always have physicians running to the upper echelon of executives to get what they want. They need to have those conversations. You got to build those communication skills. I think has been said here at the team level. That's where the engagement starts. And if you can't do that, you're never going to engage them.
Yeah. Bill, Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think it's an incredibly difficult job for leadership to do what you just asked to do, and that is, but it's likewise incredibly necessary and important. And I, my experience is I certainly just reiterate everything that Wes has said. You really have to start at all different levels of the organization. It cannot just be senior leadership. However, we take for granted that our leaders really have the skills to create the environment that we really want them to create, an environment where they listen to understand and they respond and they actually show appreciation. I'm going back to Paul's data slide. And that simply is not true. It's an assumption that is not true. So I do think there has to be some investment in providing our leadership teams at every level, not just the senior level, but at every level, the skills that they can create a totally different environment where people are valued, they're heard, they're listened to understand, they're appreciated. That's a different skill set than most leaders enter the healthcare profession.
And so I guess, Paul, then that kind of helps lead, kind of your viewpoint of, kind of how does technology complement that conversation? As physician, technology can sometimes be the bane of my existence and like the best thing since sliced bread, depending on kind of what happens. And so one of the things I'm always concerned about is, kind of the intimacy that can be lost sometimes in that technology. And if we're talking about really engaging in a human-to-human kind of way, how does data and technology enhance that kind of conversation, not only to engage clinicians, but also to improve the clinician-patient relationship?
Yeah, I personally believe that technology, if designed appropriately, can actually help perfect that face-to-face or those one-on-one interactions, right? So as both of you just mentioned, it's the culture of communicating and opening up that dialogue between clinicians and senior management is really the first step. But by making it convenient for both the clinicians and the patients to engage at whatever point in their experience matters most to them, right? Don't only give them one chance per year at that annual review to tell you what's on their mind. It's how light of a lift it really is, right? You're not having to have an entire team dedicated to this, but ensuring they know that, hey, if something comes up that is worth sharing and worth making us aware of, you can always tell us about it via this method, and we'll make sure we listen. That is where, again, if designed appropriately, it actually adds a lot of convenience to this, and it helps streamline the initiation of some of these ideas. So again, you're not banking on your team to remember what was important to me 2 months ago when this X, Y, and Z happened, right? Giving them a chance to share it candidly and conveniently really provides for a lot of rich insight that if leadership uses can really make a big difference.
And, kind of West, Bill, kind of how have you seen that technology really come into play from your, kind of viewpoint?
Go ahead.
I think in a lot of ways, and I see And I see a bit of a divide in my younger physicians and my older physicians with regard to the use of technology, where I get older physicians still wanting to get paper data and younger physicians loving the new technology, getting stuff on their phone, just running with it. And you can embrace both of them. But the technology, the real-time technology, and I love the timely data, is something none of us have ever had. I mean, even to this day, we struggle for timely data. Showing someone something that just happened within the past week or the past 2-3 days and it correlating to their experience is more of a help to change their attitude, change their mind, put them in team than anything else. I mean, that's where I see the biggest bang for the buck, at least on the pragmatic standpoint.
Just a quick comment. I think that every single technology that's been introduced into healthcare has had the intent of actually creating a more humanistic approach and making the workload easier. Unfortunately, the majority of technologies that have been introduced have done just the opposite. And so I sort of rely on a good friend, Dr. Bridget Duffy, who has challenged all of the people that are introducing technology to actually look at a metric for humanity. Is your technology going to make this different or not? Is it going to enhance humanity? Is it going to enhance engagement? All well-intentioned, but we really have skipped over that. And so is it going to create more burnout? Is it going to produce thriving? ... So we really need to think about, when we launch technology, coupling it to that kind of analysis as well.
One thing I would like.
Go ahead, Paul.
If you don't mind, Jen. So, oftentimes when we think of this engagement or we think of getting feedback from individuals, we automatically think, all right, I'm going to learn very useful opportunities for improvement, or I know we need to make adjustments here. But the reality is, with a lot of our partner organizations, more often than not, patients are actually giving compliments or highlighting things that went exceptionally well in their experience. And when you talk about getting clinician buy-in or engagement and really reinforcing some of these best practices, that's actually one of the biggest benefits of this real-time engagement, because you can send that physician a note saying, hey, your patient Paul this afternoon said you did a phenomenal job being patient with him and his son, and it was really a wonderful experience. That, we talk about morale, it's not just appreciation for management, but it's appreciation from the individuals you are providing care for. It continues to go a really long way with a lot of our organizations.
And so I guess, kind of that bridges us into this conversation about moving, as we've moved experience efforts from tactile, again, to one of more culturally based, communication, human-centered based. The conversation around burnout is actually moving away from wallowing in how bad things are to really, again, getting to skills around resiliency and then ultimately creating this enriching culture that allows for thriving. Bill, I'm curious kind of, where you are on that, kind of your viewpoint on how that conversation has really changed.
Yeah, I think a couple things to highlight here. It's been, when we think about our journey in burnout, we've talked about it for a long time. It's similar to patient experience, similar to engagement, and we've not really seen movement. And so if I was going to be talking about it and addressing it, I would really try to address it in the sense of, how can we actually create an environment where you are thriving in your work, rather than let's talk about how burnt out you are. Because talking about how burnt out you are just creates lots of negative emotions that actually even fuel the cycle, and you get more burnt out and you get stuck into this rut. So I don't really address it even if an organization is interested in doing work in this space, we try to move it away from burnout to thriving. And when we've been able to, with the national task forces in partnership with the Institute, create some metrics that actually are validated metrics that measure thriving and resiliency. And it turns out that when you can connect your teams, your individuals and teams, to frequent small doses of positive emotions. So back to what Paul was just talking about, taking the data and using that to connect to frequent small doses. There's multiple ways. That's where you promote thriving. And for the first time, when you actually measure thriving and resiliency, you can map specific solutions that will either drive thriving or drive recovery resiliency that are meaningful and customizable for an organization or a team. So shifting from how bad we are to what is it we want to be and how good we are is one important thing. Focusing on connecting to positive emotions, and then using that and your tools to really drive your customizable actions is the way that we've tried to make meaningful improvement in this whole, really probably one of the most significant problems facing American medicine.
Yeah, and so, kind of Paul, with our last couple of minutes in the Q&A, can you talk about that? Talk about what you've seen in the data with regards to the impact COVID-19 and the pandemic has really had on, kind of this element, whether it be the experience and or the elements of burnout, particularly at the clinician level.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So the COVID-19 pandemic, the survey we mentioned earlier, we did it in two ways. We did it once in April and again in May. And we did see pretty significant improvements over that month because things settled in a bit and they understood the importance of engagement and putting policies in place that could actually make the physicians' jobs a bit easier or make them feel a bit more supported. The one thing that, Dr. Maples was just touching on, in order to kind of encourage a thriving culture or reinforce some of these best practices, that really is something that a lot of our clients and partners have started doing and gone live with recently. Rather than asking, what is one thing we could be doing better, they're asking, what is one thing we are doing exceptionally well? Or what is the most important aspect, or what was the best interaction you had while you were in our hospital today? Because again, they understand how big of a role morale plays in this and how big and how much that appreciation means to these individuals. And we have seen actually, it's kind of counterintuitive, but several of the organizations who have gone live with this since the COVID-19 pandemic started, they've actually seen, and they had really high at-risk rates of turnover or burnout, they've actually seen their numbers reduce because they've seen the morale. They've done, the weekly engagement with the nurses, but then once a month they're asking them, all right, how do you feel today versus a month ago? How do you feel today versus a month ago? And they really are feeling more supported. And a lot of that data is pointing to the fact that they've changed the way they're asking questions. I don't want to say it's all mental, but it really is. This encouragement and this morale building is incredibly impactful for a lot of these individuals who are on the front lines dealing with the stress of the uncertainties of the COVID-19 situation.
Well, that's a perfect way for us to end our conversation today. I really want to thank the three of you again, Paul, West, and Bill, for being with us today, taking the time to really educate us on, kind of where things are going. Again, it sounds like we're shifting language, shifting perspective, both in the experience arena as well as burnout and others, and, kind of moving us again from burnout to resiliency to thriving so that we have an experience that allows all of us to have better outcomes, both at the patient level and the clinician level. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Paul for a couple closing statements and an opportunity for you as attendees.
Thank you, Jen. So everybody, thank you so much for joining. I hope it's obvious that we do believe in this approach of the real-time relevant engagement, and kind of as a token of our appreciation for joining or signing up for the webinar, we'd love for you all to also experience our platform and the value of the data you can get by engaging in this manner. So we're going to be offering a 21-day free trial of our platform so you can learn what your nurses and or physicians are experiencing specifically as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic and what they're anticipating or expecting moving forward. So if you're interested, we will be sending out a follow-up email with some information on how to set up a meeting with one of our customer success managers to get up and running. But once you've collected that feedback and once you've done that engagement, our leadership and IHE leadership will make ourselves available to help you analyze that data and then help identify some best practices we've seen from other organizations that you all can implement right away to ensure your clinicians are equipped to provide the best care possible moving forward. But yeah, we will send a follow-up email with that, as well as a video of this webinar and the corresponding slides in the next couple of days for you all.
So again, thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. Thanks again to our panelists and the entire team behind the scenes, bringing this all into fruition. Should you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can see the email here. Again, Feedtrail and IHE will avail themselves to attendees to have that really needed personal and timely interaction with y'all. Again, as Paul said, we will be sending you all a follow-up email with access to the recording of the event, along with the slides for your future use. And so with that, we really appreciate that you're here. Please be safe, and thank you for all that you do on the front lines to take care of all of us.